our next presentation is going to be a roundtable from our scroll saw cutters. And we have with us today Shay, Mary, Thomas, Chris, and Conrad, who will all speak about their experiences of making jigsaw puzzles with, cutting jigsaw puzzles with a scroll saw. They're really here to share all of their knowledge and experiences. So you can submit questions through the chat room, and we will ask, for some questions you can direct them, specifically to one person, but in most cases we'll allow each one of the panelists to answer the question from their own perspective. So these folks have a great deal of experience. Some have cut a lot of puzzles in a short amount of time. Others have cut fewer puzzles, but over a much longer period of time. And I assume that all, like myself, a lot of them have learned by actually trying and making lots of mistakes and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So if you ask them about their blades, about their saws, about their glue, about their wood, any of the questions that you would like to ask, you can also ask about, what were the mistakes that you made. So I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their experience, or about, how they got into cutting, what got them started, and a little bit about their experience. So I see that 4 of us are here right now. And we are expecting Mary Lush to join us. She is in Australia, and it's 5:30 in the morning, I believe, there. So, hi, Mary. Can you?
Look.
And we do see you up here, but not your screen. There. Anyway, Conrad, how about you start off and tell us about yourself and your cutting experience?
Well, I grew up in a family that had a few dozen old puzzles from the 30s, and my dad commissioned some retired guy in the 70s to cut more puzzles. So I had all these ideas in my head of puzzles cut from many people. Then my dad spontaneously bought a scroll saw as an impulse buy, and he and I started experimenting with wood and blades and glues, and he asked around the community. That's how we met people like Ann Williams and Paige Elliott. And I just picked up on the technique, and it was around 1990, and I've been making puzzles for my friends and family, and occasionally on commission since then, although not very frequently, but I've been doing it a lot more the past few years.
Thank you, Conrad. Shay, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Shay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure because I'm on my telephone. So I discovered wood puzzles when I went to a bed and breakfast about 10 years ago. And at that point in time, I started collecting puzzles. I wasn't yet cutting them. But I found that collecting was pretty expensive, so I started buying some puzzles off of eBay. Those ones often were missing pieces or had damage. And so I started using a hacksaw, craft blade, Dremel to repair pieces and make new pieces. I finally bought myself a saw. I used a DeWalt saw at that time, and I still have that one, and also an Excalibur that I use. And I decided to cut my own puzzle, and that was in March of 2014. I have kept a log of all of my puzzles that I've cut, so it's pretty interesting for myself, even for me to go back and look at the iterations of puzzles that I've done over time. And the mistakes and such, I tried to document all of those as well. But in August of 2014, I went to my second Puzzle Parley. The first one I went purely as a collector and enthusiast. The second one I went to, I attended a workshop, and Roz was there helping people to learn to use the saws. And that's when I really got a good feel for the different types of blades, the woods people were using, how to glue things together, because I had just been making it up prior to then, just trying. And at that point, I learned a whole lot. So the Puzzle Parley to me is great. I love the Puzzle Parley. After that, I continued to cut puzzles, just like Conrad said, for, friends, occasionally a commission. But in, it was early 2019, I quit my corporate job and moved to South Dakota and built myself, or my husband and I built ourselves a new house, and I put a puzzle workshop in it. As it happened in April of 2020, Melinda Shebel had been contacted by Waterford Puzzle Company, and then I believe she contacted Lisa Lee, who contacted me, and I ended up working for the Waterford Puzzle Company, subcontracting my cutting out. So I built my puzzle workshop and was able to then start a part-time job cutting puzzles for a company that I really enjoy. In addition to that, I cut puzzles myself and have an Etsy store. And I still do restorations and occasionally sell those. So that's my history, and I am happy to share in this forum as well as email or on Facebook, all of the different methods I've used, the mistakes I've made, etc.
Thank you, Shay. And we have Tom Spencer with us. Tom, can you tell us about your experience, puzzle background?
I guess about 30 years ago, I got a Sears scroll saw as a Father's Day gift. And I started cutting things, just going out in the wild and, getting cedar and just cutting things out. But I never really got into making puzzles. And then I finally said, enough of this pinned blade scroll saw. And I bought a Dremel saw. And I think I started cutting puzzles with that. And then from there, I moved up to the DeWalt. And now I have a Seiko. And I think it's less and less vibration as you go, which makes it a lot easier to make finer cuts. And it's just matter for me. It's just been practice, practice, practice. And I have these little 2-piece puzzles that I make that I call doodles. And they have taught me to cut real fine spiral type cuts and all kinds of crazy things.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Mary, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Well, I should thank you, Joe, for persuading me to do this, because I've never been to a puzzle parley. Joe said to me that I had no excuse in that case with the Zoom one. But I'm not really an early morning person, but what I've seen so far has been terrific, and it would have been great to have had access to it many years ago. Yeah, so when Joe asked me about this, I said that it looked like a great thing to me to attend, because I'd learn a lot. And I'm sure that's true, but it means I feel a little bit like an imposter in the company of people here. I sort of fell into cutting puzzles. I like puzzles in one way or another. I found myself in the US in Anne Williams' basement, where she said to me, would you like to try cutting a piece or something or other? And I did, and that was the first and only lesson that I ever had in scroll saw, with a scroll saw. But she also took me to Elms puzzles, which, as I recall, wasn't all that far away. And I saw them cutting those puzzles. I don't know whether Elms puzzles still exist. When I got home, I had no intention at all of cutting puzzles. But after a few months, I thought, well, actually, it would be quite interesting. So I bought a scroll saw. The brand I bought was a Delta with a 16-inch throat. I don't think Delta's sold in Australia anymore, but it may be around in the US. I couldn't afford a Hegner. I have no idea what Anne's machine was, but unless it was a Hegner, I've never used one, and it seems to be these regarded as the Rolls Royce of these things. I bought the only blades available to me in the sort of woodworking stores in Melbourne, which is in the sort of south part of Australia where I live. And I got absolutely no joy, I might say, from anything I did until I must have contacted Betsy Stewart of Elms, and she said, well, try using, go to Scroll Saw America and try using their narrow curved blades. And that made all the difference. It's just chalk and cheese compared to the sort of blades I'd been able to buy in a store in Australia. There are other blades that I've since come across. Sarah White, who's an English cutter, put me onto another lot, but I still prefer the Scroll Saw America narrow curved blades. And I should say actually that people have been very generous to me. Betsy Stewart was, and people like Sarah White were always very generous in sharing their knowledge. Okay, so from then on, it was just been a process of learning for me. And Chris Yates dealt with some of the things in his talk, you know, the thing about not having sharp points. From my point of view, I think that you're getting somewhere. I used to try, there's a hold down on the Delta saw. I don't know if there is on all of them or not. You really shouldn't need to be using a hold down. If you do need to use one, I think, then you've still got a bit to learn. I use 3 or 5 ply wood, and I use an Australian species called hoop pine. In Australia, it's become quite important to use, if you're making wood products, become quite important to use timbers that are certified as sustainably harvested. And hoop pine is a plantation grown wood. It's quite pale, it's quite soft. It's not especially beautiful, I'd have to say. I guess the thing that for me that I think that I would like to learn from this session particularly really is to do with this. So what I do is stick an image down to the surface, and I've never resolved entirely to my satisfaction minimizing the damage that the saw causes along the cut line. You know, there are lots of things that are involved. I've found, you know, one is the blades. I'll just go back. I can't think, somebody in Anne's session had a jigsaw they showed, and they said they thought that the image had been rather destroyed by the cutting style, and that was the sort of damage that I'm talking about, that you can get along the edges of pieces that can ruin things. I just made a little list here of the things that seemed me to influence that. One is the blades you're using. One's the direction of the grain in the wood can affect things. The texture of the paper can affect things. Paper has a grain too, and the grain of the paper can make a difference. Sometimes papers delaminate, so papers are a bit like plywood, they're sort of laminated, and sometimes they delaminate. Then there's the adhesive, and no doubt there's the skill of the cutter. And perhaps there's the precision of the movement of the blade, and hence the quality of the machine, but I'm not sure about that. So I'm hoping somebody's going to say something about how they minimize damage. Thanks, Joe. I've gone on a bit long.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you. And yeah, these are all you've raised some great points that we can start with. And so, Chris, can you, we've watched your video, but in case people weren't here this morning, can you let us know about your puzzle experience?
Sure. Sure. Thank you, Joe. And it's good to see everybody here. Thanks again, Mary, for waking up so early. I paint my puzzles, so I may not be much of a help with the whole damaging prints things, but hopefully some of the other people can shed some light upon that. My puzzle history, I started making puzzles in 2004. I went to art school in Rhode Island, and I was mostly doing sculpture, and I was really into making three-dimensional wooden maps as wall hangings. Like if you've seen the Stephen Colbert show from home in the last year, that map he has right behind his head, that's pretty much what I was making 20 years ago. And they were, you know, hand cut, they took forever and didn't sell so well. One day I had an accident. I got mad at my sculpture and I cut it up into little bits on my scroll saw that I bought to make rivers in landscape models. You know, I had no idea I could use the same thing to make jigsaw puzzles. But sure enough, I had a sort of a light bulb moment while I was chopping up this, you know, some wood just randomly and not having a plan. And my friends liked it. They sold better than my sculpture work. And 17 years later, this is what I do for a living. And you know, it's not the easiest job in the world, but I really enjoy it. I like being my own boss. I like being an artist. I like being a designer. I like the engineering of it. And I like interacting with the community and my customers. And you know, it's a really fun place to be in.
Thank you, Chris. I guess I should mention a little bit about myself. I don't actually recall when I started cutting puzzles. I kind of got into it backwards because I did not want to cut puzzles. I'm a puzzle collector. If folks can see behind me, there's a wall full of my puzzles, and I mostly collect older wooden jigsaw puzzles. And so I got a saw because I wanted to make replacement pieces. You know, I had puzzles that were missing pieces, and I just wanted to be able to make a replacement. So that was the reason I got my first saw. But it didn't take very long before, you know, hey, this is fun cutting these pieces, but why not cut the whole thing? So I started that sometime in the early 90s. I've been cutting since then. So 25, 28 years I've been cutting puzzles. I don't sell puzzles. I don't have a website where I sell puzzles. I make them as a hobby. I have a day job, so I don't need to cut puzzles for a living, or didn't choose to cut puzzles. I always loved making puzzles, and I didn't want to turn it into a job. So, and I will go back to Mary for a second and just mention one thing. In my experience, the cheaper, the better the paper. When you have thick paper, heavy paper, that's where you get layer splitting in the paper. So when I'm printing out an image or getting an image printed for me, I always try to specify the cheapest possible paper. Now you can get really too cheap and where you can almost see through the paper and see the wood. But that's relatively easy to solve. If you are working with something like that, you can put down a base coating on your wood, a quick hit it with a quick spray of white spray paint, and then put your paper down on top of that. But generally, I find that, yeah, you get a calendar, you want to cut this beautiful calendar picture up, and it's got really thick paper, and that's the one's going to give you all kinds of problems of what we call paper splitting or layer splitting, is when, the wood doesn't come apart, just the paper on top of the wood comes apart, and then you have to sit there with a toothpick and glue all these little tips and ends back down. So we've got questions coming in, and one of the very first one that came in is about wood, and the question was, how do you store it? How long is it good? And they're asking about Baltic birch, okume. This is a question from Carol Ottenberg, who I know is a cutter. I have some of her puzzles, but Chris, since I can see your face here, can you have any response for that?
Yeah, again, I use MDF primarily, not plywood for the most part. But in general, you want to keep it in a temperature controlled space that is not too humid or not too hot. If it gets really cold, I don't think it's as much of an issue, but living in Colorado with very low humidity, I was able to store my woods all nicely in my garage with no issue. Here in Ocean City, the humidity level is such that my boards would go warpy and moldy if I left them for more than a couple months in the garage. So I think where you keep them is important. Keeping them, I like to keep them on their edges. This is something I learned from doing a bunch of cabinet making and sign making work. If you lay your wood flat on the ground, it's more likely to warp than if you actually keep it on its sort of edge, so it's vertical. And you can make, I've also seen in woodworking shops where they actually make little boxes, kind of like little humidors almost, for their wood, so it just doesn't get contaminated with a whole lot of sawdust or various temperature swings.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
Well, I could comment because my experience has been quite different from Chris's in a way. I store mine outside, well, not outside, under cover, but outside in Melbourne. So Melbourne is well, it's in the temperate zone. We don't get snow. We do get some very hot weather. We don't get much. We don't get much humid, really humid hot weather though. I only buy internal grade plywood. I don't buy marine grade, and I've actually never had any problems with it. And I must have stored some of it for years, I would think. So some of this must depend an awful lot on, the climate where you are, I think.
Yes, climate and the type of wood.
All
Yeah,
right.
Chris, I have the opposite. Any wood, any plywood that I get a 5-ply, either kume or striped mahogany. If I used to store it vertically or on its edge, you can't help but it can't help but lean some tiny bit way, and that lean is going to become a bend at some point. So mine is all flat, either under a heavy other flat thing or underneath my bed. It is frustrating when a piece does become too warped, because then I really can't use it, or at least for a large thing. I can use it for much smaller pieces.
Yeah, I tend to buy 4x8 sheets of mahogany plywood, and which is enough to last me an awful long time. So I've not had an issue. I've had slight warping, but one of the things about warped wood is when you cut it up into a bunch of small pieces, the warp goes away.
That's true. It's actually while I'm cutting it to deal with the warp, those first cuts are awkward. But once it's all cut into pieces, if I get by those first big cuts, the person assembling it doesn't know that it used to be warped.
Shay, I see your icon popping up once in a while. You have a comment?
Well, I was just going to say that I've used the Calmo or Kume, or however somebody wants to pronounce that, as well as Baltic birch. I've also tried Baltic birch with the basswood interior layers. And when I was living in Connecticut, I had a lot of warping. I use a dry press often in order to put my images on the wood. And I found that I could put the wood in a dry press before I then went to cut it. And that took some of the warping out of it. But like Conrad, I store all of my wood flat with weights on top of it. And now that I have the puzzle workshop at my house that's climate controlled, I haven't had as much warping issues.
Yeah, and for our listeners, almost all of us use plywood. There are some cutters there that use a solid wood or a solid core wood, but almost all of us use plywood. One of the beauties of plywood is that they put the different layers, they rotate them at 90 degrees. So the grain of the wood is going in one direction on one layer, and then it's going at 90 degrees on the next layer. And so that tends to minimize the warping, because the grain of the wood is pulling against each other in different directions. And that's why plywood is such a nice wood to work with when you're making puzzles. Okay, so there's actually a question here for Tom, and they want to know, you says you cut your doodle puzzles. So they want to know, what do you do with them when you what your practice puzzles?
Mostly they are stored in a box in my garage with my saw and everything else. I did sell a few at the last live Puzzle Parley for like $10 each or something like that. And I always, I almost always enclose one whenever I send a puzzle out.
Great. There's a question up here of glossy paper. Who uses glossy paper? No, Chris doesn't. Sorry.
I can do a glossy photograph or glossy poster just as well as a matte. I don't find much of a difference. What's more of a difference is what Joe alluded to earlier. Some of the high quality posters, they think it's better to have a thicker paper, and that might be that case for a poster that you're hanging on the wall. But actually, I don't like the thick paper, because sometimes the paper is so thick that it will start to split a little bit, where a thin, strong paper is actually better. But I don't care about the surface. It doesn't make a difference to me.
Yeah, when I do an image puzzle, I use a semi-gloss presentation paper. I think I get it at Staples or something like that. And it seems to be fairly thin and has a nice cover on the wood.
I don't particularly, I don't like, I was just going to say, I don't particularly like using gloss paper because I get fingerprints on it. But
Yeah, and I was going to comment that I don't particularly like it for two reasons. Is one is, doing puzzles, I don't like a real glossy surface. You get an extreme amount of glare, especially if I'm using, a light overhead my dining room table or something. And so that annoys me. So I don't tend not to use it. But also, I made some puzzles a few years ago with photo paper, and right in the middle of cutting, I just had kind of a layer of the glue flake off. I mean, not the glue, the ink, of the image, and it was like a round piece flaked off, and it just turned out to be impossible to color that little spot. That it would not take any ink, it would not take colored pencils, it couldn't do anything. I just had this white spot where the ink had popped off, and so I stayed away from photo paper for a long time. I have cut it again, and I have not run into that problem again, but I did have it happen to me twice early on. Maybe 20 years ago, the photo paper wasn't quite as good. Shay?
And that's where I've used the Krylon Spray on top of glossy before I start to cut with it, because I have had some calendars and such I've tried to cut, and just the oils in my hand start to pull the ink off of the paper. But if I hit it with the Krylon, it's the Krylon Spray ahead of time, it seals it well enough that then my hands aren't affecting the image anymore.
I'd like to make a comment about the spray. I really didn't use it at all until I started having a problem. I finally figured out that if I take a photo to Staples and it's printed less than 11 inches on one dimension, like 11 by 17 or something, that whatever printer and ink they use is fine, and my figure piece patterns with rubber cement will come up no problem. Same image printed, 12 by 12, whatever larger printer they use for something larger than 11 inches on one side, will look the same, but it absorbs the rubber cement, and I cannot get it off using even this special eraser, etc. Finally figured out that that was the problems, but I found that if I sprayed those with the sealer a few coats, then the rubber cement comes right off. So I don't have to spray my smaller things, but I do anything that's printed on Staples' larger printer.
Yeah, Conrad, to that point, obviously I don't put prints on things, but I used to be make prints and be a sign maker. A lot of the larger format printers that a place like Staples will be solvent ink versus like a regular inkjet. So it's sort of a difference between the makeup of the ink. Some of it might be soy versus plastic based. So that's probably why that happened.
Yeah, I ran into, many years ago when I was just trying different inks and different printers, trying to see which ones were best. I had, early on stuff that was coming out of inkjet printers. If you breathed on them, the ink would run. And so you had to spray them. And so I used fixative. I used Krylon for a number of years, but I found that they changed the formula, and I started getting, different results than what I was expecting. Sometimes it would puddle up and make little dots all over the paper. But one thing that I've learned through experience is, and we can talk about glues, but I've used various glues, white glue and spray adhesive. And I have discovered that certain things like Krylon or other ones, if you use a spray adhesive to mount your paper to the wood, and then you spray it with any type of spray, fixative or clear coating or whatever, it tends to dissolve the glue, and then the paper will slide around. So I've learned that I always, if I'm going to spray, I always spray before I mount the paper. And I don't know if anybody else has seen that issue.
I never noticed that, but
that it just depends on the brand you're using. It can break down. It basically breaks down the glue. So I spray first. So there's a question here from Mark Geis in Minnesota, who wants to know if the amount of glue layers in the wood affect how quickly blades dull or snap.
Probably.
Yeah, and I would say yes, that's been my experience. And it really depends on where I get my wood. Sometimes the glues seem to have a lot more little metal flakes in it, I've noticed. And that will do a number on my saw a lot faster, or on my blades a lot faster. Also, just the type of wood that I'm cutting can make the blades wear out faster, as well as the thickness of the wood.
Yeah, I would say that the thickness and the type of wood is the biggest factor. Like, I don't like birch. It's too hard. And even just tiny bit higher than a 1/4 inch will be slower and break your blades faster than a tiny bit less than a 1/4 inch. The thickness.
Yeah, I agree with Conrad that the type of wood is important, but also the number of layers. The glue tends to be harder than the wood. So if you have 5-ply versus 3-ply, the 5-ply is going to have more glue layers, and they will wear out blades quicker. And Shay touched on something with tiny metal flakes. That's a good topic for tomorrow's discussion with our laser cutters, because those tiny flakes of metal that sometimes are found in the glue layers are a real disaster for the laser cutters. The scroll saw cutters, it'll just chew through your blades. All right, so we got a question here for Chris. What is MDF?
Okay, so medium density fiberboard, otherwise known as MDF, is most commonly used for like it's like generally used for like the back of cabinets and things like that. You can get it at Home Depot. That's where I generally get it, but you have to be extremely picky about it, because MDF is basically reconstituted sawdust with glue or an impregnated resin. So basically in a sawmill, they will have all kinds of different wood that's coming through, and then they will basically take the sawdust, like the big chips, they'll put into, particle board or wafer board, and just the sawdust gets taken into these. It's kind of a bizarre process. It's kind of like they're casting wood. So it's basically cast and rolled out in compressed sheets. I think it's great for what I do. Not everybody loves MDF. But for me, it gives me a really consistent product. I never have voids. I very rarely ever have cracking issues. I generally try to look for what I call the blonder kind of MDF. Like the darker stuff, especially if it's got lots of little visible hairs in it, is not going to cut so well, and you're going to have all these weird hairs you're going to have to sand off. Whereas the stuff that's sort of like the color of like, I don't know, like Betty from, Archie Comics hair, blonde. That stuff is pretty nice. Yeah, it's, as I said in my presentation, it does have some weaknesses. It doesn't like water or humidity. But once you get it cut up, as Joe was saying earlier, you really, even if you have a little bit of a warpy board, it's pretty much mitigated. But yeah, it's better for, I think, my weird style of painting things than if you're doing a regular print puzzle. Plywood is probably a better way to go.
Can I ask a question about that? And this probably differs from one country to another, but in Australia, there used to be people who would refuse to cut MDF. Laser cutter people actually would even refuse to cut it because of volatiles or things released when cutting.
This is correct, Mary. I actually spent a half year in Sydney at Sydney College of the Arts in Rozelle, if you know that area, if you've ever been out there. It was wonderful. It was a great time. And yes, they are a little bit stricter out there, even 20 years ago when I was there. California in America is quite strict about MDF, and it can't have any formaldehyde resin in it. So a lot of these places have stopped using formaldehyde resin and are using other kinds of impregnating resins that are less toxic. But I always recommend wearing a mask whenever you're cutting MDF. But once it gets into the customer's hands, it's inert. There's no sawdust left. I've blown it all off. So yes, you got to be careful with it, but it's not exactly like, ceramics or glass blowing type dangerous, cutting MDF. But yes, some places are stricter about this kind of stuff than others. And the manufacturers are getting wise to the fact that they won't be able to sell to a lot of places because more and more people are being stricter with their OSHA. OSHA is what we call in America, like the Occupational Safety and Health something association. I don't know. It's like the government authority on, you know, workplace safety. So yeah, it's getting better all the time. I've tried some more natural materials like pressed bamboo. It's got some promise to it. And you can do kind of cool things like that with like staining and dyeing it. But I find its density is just like it's way too weak and fragile. But it's recommended for kids' puzzles because it's like if the kid puts the pressed bamboo piece in his mouth, it's like, who cares? It's completely organic. With my MDF stuff, I obviously have people with small children who probably play with my puzzles, but I generally recommend that they're, you know, ages 14 or up. But obviously, you know, it's like your kids can do whatever they want, you know, with my puzzles. You know.
All right.
But can I-
Conrad.
Yes, actually, again, plugging the Puzzle Parley concept. It was 2 or 3 years ago at a Puzzle Parley. Someone who cuts puzzles, I forget his name, who's also a doctor, gave
Sean
an
Ferguson.
excuse me?
Sean Ferguson.
Thank you. Gave a presentation on the glues that are in plywood and how scroll saws in particular, more as compared to table saws, give off a sawdust that's at such a fine a micron level that these simple masks that we're all familiar with don't cut it, so to speak. And I immediately went out and bought a proper mask that filters down at a smaller level of micron because of his presentation. And this is only like $35, and you can now find them. You couldn't find them a year ago. So I recommend if you're cutting plywood, get yourself a proper mask, and your lungs will thank you later.
Yeah, I've taught classes, scroll saw classes, and one of the things that I always tell people, you know, is that people come and they think that the most dangerous thing is the blade, and the blade in a scroll saw is very small. I always tell people the most dangerous thing is the sawdust. You know, that if it gets into your lungs or in your eyes, and it depends on the kind of wood you're using, not just the glue, but even if you're just cutting solid woods, there's a lot of hardwoods that have their own natural resins in there that are not good for the human being. And you don't want that stuff in your eyes or in your lungs. And so I always recommend a mask, and that, yeah, your number one safety concern is actually, you know, related to the sawdust. So, and we do have some more questions popping up here. There's one question is asking if any of the cutters use self-stick vinyl. Someone else also put a question in about using full-page Post-it to put down their patterns or figurals. And so I know that what I've been using for several years is Post-it makes a tape, you know, the regular yellow Post-it notes, sticky notes that you can put everywhere. They also make rolls of tape, 1 inch wide tape, which I put down first and then draw or trace, or sometimes I'll actually print up a sheet of patterns and spray the back with adhesive. But when I stick them down to the Post-it tape, not directly to the image. I've really never had a problem with Post-it tape lifting the paper as or leaving residue as I take it off. You know, unless in some cases, a few cases, I've left it on there for months at a time. But even then, the residue comes up quite easy with the rubber cement eraser that Conrad mentioned earlier. Shay?
Yeah, I've used painter's tape. So I will use, I had been using a spray adhesive or rubber cement to put my paper onto the painter's tape, and then actually the painter's tape is what touches the front part of the puzzle, because I had the residue sometimes from the rubber cement that was then frustrating to get off. The other thing I've done, I've designed on my computer the entire cut for a puzzle before, and I found that transfer paper that people who make signs use, I could take that and put it on top of the puzzle and then spray adhesive my entire design on top of that. which I could then follow to cut the puzzle. And that transfer paper that sign makers use comes off very easily. Of course, the downside is every single piece of puzzle that I cut, I had to go peel that off. So that was very labor intensive. It was good for maybe 1 or 2 puzzles, but it's not something I'm going to do regularly.
So back to our previous topic, a question came in about using dust collection systems. Does any of these 5 cutters have a dust collection system?
I use the opposite. I use an air compressor just to blow things off every, week or so and just put things in a dustpan. When I was making furniture and larger things, I did have, a dust extraction system. It's like one of those 5-gallon bucket kind of things. But with scrolls, puzzle work, it doesn't really kick up that much dust if you're wearing a mask. I think it's fairly negligible, but other people may differ in opinion.
I don't use a dust collection system. I know my dad had one installed when we first got a scroll saw, and I just found it was loud and running constantly and wasn't really needed. Like as Chris says, scroll saw creates hardly any dust. I don't even have a separate room for it. It's in an alcove, and the dust doesn't go more than 2 feet. I find that just about the time that I want to exchange the blade, whether it breaks or it's become dull to my liking, that's when I stop the saw, and as I'm changing the blade, I have a little vacuum, and I just press a button and just hose right around the area and underneath and turn it off, and boom.
Yep.
And having my puzzle workshop in my home, I guess I'm opposite of Conrad in that way. First, when I designed the workshop, I did not have them put an air return in this room because I didn't want the dust being pulled into my furnace and such. But I used the Festool HEPA dust vac, and I got it hooked up to something called a Scrollnado, which is made to fit as a wall, and then I've jimmied it around to fit my Excalibur. So it's actually pulling the dust as I cut it directly where the blade is, and I get no dust that way, which is phenomenal. I don't really have to stop and clean up at all, which I appreciate. So Conrad, you're right. The noise of that vacuum is pretty loud. I use my headphones, and then I have those noise canceling headphones, and listening to music or books or digital books or whatever I may be listening to at the time.
Mary, what do you do about your dust?
Well, I have a sort of shed out the back, and I just don't worry about it all that much, I'm afraid. I wear a mask.
Okay, I'm kind of a cross between you and Chris, where, I cut out in my garage, and, for a long time, I could not find a mask that did not fog up my glasses. And so it was a real problem for me. So I settled on just a fan. I have a little 5-inch fan that I have sitting next to me, and it blows right across my face to make sure that the dust doesn't reach me. And so I get dust on the floor, and I have to vacuum up the garage from time to time, but I'm confident that I'm not breathing dust as I'm cutting.
When I bought my Seiko, it came with a vacuuming system that has a magnetic clip on what you fasten right by the saw blade, and it takes all the dust that's generated underneath the saw, which is probably 75–80% of it, and it's kept things a lot cleaner in the area of the saw. And wearing a mask, of course, helps. But also in the summertime, I have a big fan blowing across my surface and on me. And in the wintertime, it's a small fan with a heater. So it's that garage stuff, Joe.
Yeah. Well, I got a comment here from Beth at Peach Blossom Puzzles. She says she uses an Oneida dust deputy in the room connected to a shop vac that's in another room so that she doesn't have to hear the noise.
Turn the volume.
The other thing about, I know what those are like. The noises is loud, but that's a good idea to put in another room. The other thing you also have to think about is your energy use. Your dust extraction system will probably suck up at least twice as much power as your scroll saw, or your sander, or even a table saw would kick up. It's going constantly, and it's, you know, it's got a lot of amps to it.
Yeah, I don't remember the particular brand. I do know that, you know, there's dust collectors that are large, that look like shop vacs, and there's other ones that are smaller and so on. And depending on whether you want to spend $100 or a few $1,000s, you can get some that are really nice and quiet. I believe, if I remember correctly, Dave Beth and the Greenie at Fool's Gold Puzzles has one that's fairly quiet and fairly small. He has a fairly a confined area where he works on his puzzles or cuts his puzzles. So you can spend money and get whatever you want.
Yeah, I believe the Dust Deputy line is sold through woodcraft.com. They have a great catalog and online. I mean, they also ship worldwide, Mary. If you're looking for a good wood supply company, woodcraft.com, they've got lots and lots of great resources and things.
So, Chris, what brand of blades do you use?
I'm still stuck on Olson's, man. I like them. It started with Olson's, and hey, good man. And I've tried the Pegas, or Pegas, whatever you want to call them, and a couple other ones. They seem all right, but I'm just so used to exactly how the Olsons sort of fare. Like, it's like if you're a guitarist and you'd been playing with the same kind of strings for 17 years, and all of a sudden you change strings, your guitar playing would be a little bit altered. So it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, you know? And
what size?
the 2.0s, the 1/100th of an inch thick ones, just regular, the 228 TPI per inch. In my video, I forgot to say, I said it's 28 teeth. Obviously, the blade actually has 28 teeth per each of the 5 inches. And I just like the skip tooth. I've tried, as you were mentioning before in our previous presentation, Joe, reverse tooth blades can be really handy, especially if you're working with things that you want to have a clean front and back. But for MDF, for some reason, it doesn't really, it makes the front look kind of crappy, and the back isn't any cleaner. So I find the palm sander takes care of any of the burrs, the 2.0 blades just fine on MDF. And then of course, I am cutting some thicker wood here and there, because a lot of my puzzles have bases, like those inlaid trays that my pieces go into. Actually, I've got a puzzle right here. So this part, you know, it's got a thicker edge, so it's going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. So you wouldn't want to cut that with a 2/0 blade. You want to cut that with something a little bit chunkier. I usually just use these weird Ryobi blades that I think are 7 TPI, and they are a skip hook tooth. And they're a little aggressive, but they cut nice, you know, straight lines, and they clean up super nice on the palm sander. You don't want to get too thin with a blade when you're cutting thicker material. Otherwise, it's really hard to get a straight line. You know, it's thinner the blade, the easier it is to do curvy stuff, but the harder it is to cut a straight line. And so a thicker blade is going to give you more edge fidelity, as you've got more momentum behind it, and it's not going to move left or right so much. Of course, if you're making a really squiggly thing with thicker wood, you want to use something thinner.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
for all kinds of things.
thanks. Mary, how about you? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, well, I use the narrow curve ones. I'm just trying, I think they are a 2-something-0 narrow, but they are specified as narrow curve NK, I think it's abbreviated as. And I tried a lot of different blades when I started, and I've since occasionally, you know, I tried things like, there's a spiral blade, or which I tried once too. But in the end, I like, for the puzzles I make, I like things to be quite close fitting. So yeah, I stick with the narrow curve.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. You know, Mary mentioned the spiral blades, and you know, a lot of people have asked me you know, when we talked about puzzles, do you use the spiral blades? And no, the spiral blades for a long time just had a much thicker kerf. You know, the gap left from cutting and just made the pieces much too loose. So I don't believe anybody that is using a spiral blade regularly, unless it's a special project or something. Conrad?
So to answer the question that just popped up, a spiral blade cuts in any direction. So most blades just cut in one forward facing direction. Spiral blade, you can move every which way. But the kerf, as Joe said, is usually 3 to 4 times the 1/100th of an inch that a 2/0 blade is.
25 thousandths of an inch.
Where'd he come from?
Do I have to mute this guy?
Oh, man.
Yeah, we mute him.
Trust me, you can't do it.
Throw them out.
Yeah, I never tried spiral blade because people said it cuts a much wider curve, and I, as many cutters do, and puzzle collectors do, appreciate a tight fitting puzzle. I used to use some Olsen and some other brands. I've gone back and forth over the years, or for a while there, I liked a type of blade, and then I felt that the quality was bad and it was getting more dull. But lately I've been using a Pegasus from Bear Wood Supply. It's 0.0085 by 0.024, and I'm pretty happy with it.
Thanks. And for your non-cutters, 2.0, you know, blades run from negative numbers all the way up into like size 12 for scroll saws. And size 12, you'd want to be cutting, you know, some really thick 2-3 inch piece of wood, but most puzzle cutters use what's called a 2.0 blade. And there are a variety of manufacturers, and so they tend to, you have 2 dimensions on the blade, or there are 3 specifications. One is the number of teeth per inch. The number of teeth per inch from the various manufacturers tends to run from about 24 up to about 30. The front to back thickness is, you know, from the different manufacturers, run from anywhere from about 0.02 inches or 20/100ths of an inch up to about 30/100ths of an inch. And then the thickness of the blade, what gives you the curve, or the gap, tends to run from about 0.008 or 8/1000ths of an inch on up to 12/1000ths of an inch. And so, you know, there is, all these manufacturers call their blades 2.0 blades, but there is a wide selection of them, and there's a variety of quality, as Conrad mentions, that, you know, some blades just seem to like to be sharper and last a lot longer, and other ones seem to get dull much quicker and maybe break a little more easily. So Thomas, what kind of blades do you use?
Let me get back to you. Right now I'm using the Pegasus modified geometry blades, the 2.0s.
Yours.
I just switched to these maybe a year ago, and I'm sold. They don't leave much kerf on the bottom, and less sanding for me. I used to use the Superior puzzle blades from Flying Dutchman, and I still keep them around, and I plan on using them again for some other things. That's the main ones I use. I use the larger blades for like Chris said, for cutting straight lines. I'll go to a #1 blade by Flying Dutchman, and you know, I do occasionally do these tropical bird things using like 3/4 inch wood, and I'll use a #5 or a #7 for that. I have a whole assortment of blades. So.
Yeah, I do too. And I've also found that I like different manufacturers for different styles of cutting. You know, if I'm doing swirl cuts, I like one brand versus if I'm doing more like a Stoke style, I like a different brand. You know, the fine details, very sharp blades can help you get fine details, but they don't make nice smooth curves. And so I switch blade manufacturers based on the style of cut that I might want to do. Shay, what type of blades do you like?
So I'm currently using the Pegas 2.0 skip or super skips. I also have some of the Flying Dutchman as Tom does, and I pull those out sometimes as well.
So we have a question here directed for you, and they'd like to know a little bit more about your dry press method of mounting.
Okay, so I got a dry press very early on. It was pretty inexpensive. I bought it off of eBay used. I never had used one before, so it's taken me a while to figure out how to use it best. Plus, I found out its temperature gauge is not accurate, which wasn't very helpful. But what I do is I get some of the adhesive dry mount paper, tissue paper, and that goes on top of the wood, which depending on the wood, sometimes I give the wood a light sanding before I put that on there, and other times I don't. Then on top of the adhesive paper, I put the image I'm going to use on the puzzle next. On top of that, I've been using a 4mm perforated PVC laminating film, and I could only get the matte laminating film. You get this in rolls as well as the adhesive paper, and so I don't make that many of my own puzzles, so to purchase rolls, when I do that, I go ahead and purchase quite a bit of wood and do a lot of mounting all at once, because both the adhesive tissue as well as the laminating film starts to go bad about after a year or so. So I get everything mounted that I need to and just store it until I'm ready to cut.
That's not good news.
But then on top of the laminating film, I learned this too. I should have probably Googled it before I tried, but if you don't put something between the laminating film and the top of the dry press, you can actually end up with laminating film on your dry press. And if you're doing it without the laminating film, you can end up with your image stuck to your dry press. So I went and Googled that after I had made that mistake. That's one of those mistakes that I've learned from. And a lot of people use a release paper, which I bake a lot, so I decided to try to use parchment paper, which works great, rather than paying the cost for the release paper. And then they take a thick, it's like a grocery bag. I can't remember what that kind of paper is called, like a craft paper, and put that over top so that the plate that heats up and presses the image onto the wood is not touching the wood or the lamination or any of that. What I did find though is I had a wrinkle in that very top layer, and so every time I would press my image onto a puzzle, that matte laminating film had a wrinkle in it. And that got me thinking about, could I do some sort of a pattern or texture on top of my that matte laminating film. So I started working with different cotton materials, and I found that a cotton drop cloth, I put that in instead of the release paper and the craft paper. I put a cotton drop cloth between my lamination film and the top plate, and it actually presses that pattern into the laminating film. So the puzzles that I made for the exchange this year have this pattern pressed into them from my canvas drop cloths. And it's been suggested to me by Janelle that maybe I should start looking at doing lace patterns and such and making that part of the puzzle as well. So something to think about.
Okay, great. Thank you. It looks like we're just about done. I will make one quick comment on several years ago, I asked several of the cutters who attended the Parley to send me samples of their different mounting processes and woods and so on. And through my job, I have access to large temperature chambers that I can do fast cycles of heat and humidity to basically age something, do 10 years of aging in a short period of time. And I put all those samples through And just about everyone that used the dry mount came loose or had parts of it come loose. I had other things issues, different brands of spray started getting cloudy or turning colors. I had some people whose woods delaminated and everything else. I presented all that at a Puzzle Parley several years ago, but I don't know if I still have all those files, but I like to, try to do my best to test any materials that I'm using. As a collector, I have puzzles that are 200 years old that are still staying together, and I have puzzles that are 60 or 70 years old and are completely falling apart. So at any rate, I want to thank everybody who submitted questions, and I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today.